I'm Alexis Opferman. I'm an MBA too, and one of the student directors of the Corporations and Society Initiative. We are very glad to have Nicole Perlroth with us today for a discussion about cybersecurity and AI and disinformation, or wherever we want to take the conversation. So I have a few prepared questions here, but then I'll open it up to the audience for questions for the last 20 minutes or so. So Nicole, first of all, welcome. Thanks for being here.
Thank you so much. I almost didn't make it, and the reason we have this one is in part is my husband was in a horrible ski accident over the weekend, so he is about to have part 2 of his emergency surgeries, and but I didn't want to cancel on you all because this is actually one of my favorite things I do all year is come to the GSB, and I've been in Glenn Cramon's business writing class and Keith Hennessy's US-China class, and it's always sort of the thing when I at the end of the year when I ask myself, okay, what are the things I did that brought me the most joy? This is always one of them. So thank you for having me, always.
Yeah, well, we're so glad to do this today, and especially given the circumstances, thank you for making time for this. So Nicole, you've had a very interesting career. You got into cybersecurity initially at the New York Times as the lead cybersecurity journalist, where you spent more than a decade there. And you also wrote a book that was a New York Times bestseller, This Is How They Tell Me the World Ends. Incredible book. For those of you who haven't had the chance to read it, I definitely recommend. You also have spent some time in the public sector, advising for CISA, and more recently, you've gone into venture capital, starting your own venture capital firm, where you are now investing in cybersecurity technology. So quite a career. I love the story about how you initially got into cybersecurity. Would you share that, and also how that led you to where you are now?
Yeah, so let's see, this was maybe 2009. I had, in retrospect, a very cush, blissful job covering venture capital at Forbes magazine. And things were picking up, after the dot-com crash and secondaries, and people were super interested in Facebook and Uber and Twitter. And so VCs were on the rise again, and I wrote a number of stories about people like Peter Thiel and Jim Breyer. And I think the New York Times was paying attention. So they called me one day and they said, "We're looking at you for a job, but we're not sure you're going to want it." And I said, "How bad could it be? You're the New York Times, I'll take whatever it is." And they said, "It's cybersecurity." And I remember trying to stifle this audible groan, you want to take me off this very exciting beat of venture capital right now, which is just picking up again, and put me on something that's very technical, that I have no background in. And frankly, at that time, I thought it was even a little boring. So I said, okay, I will come interview. But I told myself, if the New York Times thinks they're hiring some cybersecurity expert for this job, it's going to be a disaster. So I went to the New York Times, and it was 13 interviews over the course of 2 days. And every time, after every interview, I said, by the way, don't hire me to cover cybersecurity. Here's a short list of people that I think cover cybersecurity quite well. You should hire them. But I was interviewing with the New York Times food critic at the time. And so I used the opportunity to ask him things like, what's the restaurant you will not write about because it's so good you don't want to ruin it for yourself? And what's your exercise regimen, because you're quite svelte, but I know you're eating out all the time. And so my last interview was with this managing editor, John Geddes, and he said, I have 2 questions for you. One, what scares you about this place? And I said, everything. And he said, good, because the best people who come in here come in scared. The worst people aren't scared enough. And he said, 2, do you consider yourself a better writer or a better reporter? And I said, I think I'm a better writer. I'm still really learning reporting. And he said, well, we disagree, because Sam Sifton said you got out of him that his favorite restaurant is the Dutch, which is what it was. And every sort of person who interviewed you had a similar story. They told you things that they wouldn't have told anyone else. So we think you're a pretty good reporter. And we hear that you keep giving everyone the short list of cybersecurity reporters to hire. And I don't know if anyone's told you this yet, but we actually interviewed everyone on your list. And we couldn't understand a single goddamn thing they were saying. So they said, you're hired because you've been translating technology quite well, and we need a translator. Mm-hmm. And so I walked in the same month Stuxnet was discovered. A lot of you may know Stuxnet. This was the US-Israeli operation against an Iranian nuclear plant. And then I walked out more than 10 years later after the supply chain attack called SolarWinds, where Russia had essentially compromised a software company and then used their software update as a way to break into a lot of federal agencies and major US Fortune 500 companies. And in between, everything was a big first. And so I finally got a call from the Biden administration. Congress had mandated that they set up an advisory board at CISA, which was this new cybersecurity agency that got a little bit famous in the 2020 election when Chris Krebs, who was the director, said this was the most secure election in history. And she said, we really want a journalist on this board. And that meant leaving journalism. I don't think they realized that, because you can't be a journalist and kind of inside the government tent at the same time. So I left the New York Times and I went inside and I said, I'll do this, but I don't want a security clearance. Do not give me a security clearance. Because if you get a security clearance, then you have to get government review for everything you write. And so that was my worst nightmare if I ever wanted to get back to journalism. And then my first meeting, my husband, I said, I'm going to DC for my first meeting. And I went out and they said, sign this, and they sent us all into a skiff. And what they told me, they declassified, so I can tell you, which was Russia's going to invade Ukraine. And we have the date, and we're very worried about the potential for cyber blowback. So that's what I did sort of inside the tent for a couple of years during the Biden administration, and then I was fired last January. And I've been doing advising and venture capital ever since.
Wow, that's incredible. What an experience and a roller coaster. I know from your time at the New York Times, and potentially personally too, you know probably better than most how fast-moving and ever-changing the cyber threat is. And now in today's age, we layer on AI. How do you see that changing the cyber threat landscape?
Yeah, so AI, ChatGPT had not arrived when I wrote my book. And if you read my book, then you know a lot of it focuses on what's called the zero-day market. And a zero day is just an undiscovered vulnerability in something like your iOS software. That if I'm a hacker and I know about this vulnerability and I could potentially write a program to exploit it, don't touch that, honey, then I could potentially use that exploit to spy on you or essentially turn your iPhone into an ankle bracelet. And the time it takes to discover these zero-day vulnerabilities could be years, in some cases, for a really good one. And if you develop a really good one, you can sell it to a number of brokers. The highest bidder right now is the Saudis. They'll pay you $10 million if you can discover a really good iOS zero-day exploit. But they'll pay less, but still substantial amounts for certain zero-day exploits. When AI happened, she was 2 months old, and I just buried my head in the sand because I knew the time to create a zero-day exploit, a really good zero-day exploit, and exploit it is going to go down to sub-seconds, and that's where it is now. There's still, to find a really good iOS or Android zero-day exploit, which is really like what every government and spy agency wants. It's not going to be sub-second, but we're starting to see things like Expo, which is an AI zero-day exploit technology, top the HackerOne leaderboard. In other words, they're finding more 0 days than anyone else, AI is. We're seeing Claude win hacking competitions. So effectively, we're able to use AI to do what it took humans, experts, a small group of experts, months, sometimes years to do. And then you kind of zoom out, and what we're really seeing is that this barrier to entry, to really have kind of the sophisticated hacking capabilities of an NSA or a Unit 8200 in Israel is collapsing. And that means anyone who really has the intent will quickly develop the means or the AI tooling to be able to pull off a ransomware attack at scale, to do quiet espionage, to do living off the land, pre-positioning attacks on our critical infrastructure at scale. And the reason why I've done a lot of conversations like this year is because in this conversation around AI, when you hear sort of like Sam Altman and Dario talk about the risks, you hear a lot of risks around sort of this boogeyman of AGI, sometimes you hear about bioterrorism risks, but I actually think we're not talking enough about the immediate risk that comes with things like fully automated ransomware. And we're starting to already see, and I like to break this up and make it really tangible, because this thing gets very theoretical. Hopefully you guys can still hear me. When you think about ransomware always had some automated components, right? Like a hacker they could use scanning software to find anywhere that no one had patched for known vulnerabilities, and then they could get in. But then there were all these manual stages. They had to basically go inside and find assets that were worth encrypting. They had to encrypt those assets. They had to do payment negotiations. What we've seen over the last 6 months is that all of those manual stages are now being automated. LLMs are being trained to find those critical business assets. They're being trained to conduct a monetization strategy. We're seeing them train AI chatbots to manage payment negotiations for maximum psychological pressure. So put that all together, what they're really doing is they're using AI to automate the entire kill chain. And when you can do that, think of the number of ransomware attacks we're going to start to see. And so the sort of point and the strong takeaway on defense is all these things that cybersecurity experts have told us all to do for years. Patch for software vulnerabilities, use multi-factor authentication. All these things, it's like suddenly with AI, there's no more room for human error. All of these things will be able to be discovered and exploited at scale.
Yeah, well, the thought of the barrier to entry being lower and the kill chain being faster is pretty scary. What is AI doing to help on the defensive side, if anything?
So that's very exciting. So right now, you guys don't hear this one. So right now we're seeing, unfortunately, offense has the advantage right now. That was a big debate in the cybersecurity industry. Will AI help the bad guys or the good guys? And unfortunately, we're seeing it tilt towards the bad guys. So, and it's really with every kind of attack vector. Social engineering, we're suddenly saying, much better crafted phishing emails using ChatGPT. We're seeing deepfakes used for advanced social engineering attacks. Certainly deepfake audio. And so there are technologies coming to market like Get Real, which is one, it was my first investment when I decided to move into the investing space, that does real-time deepfake detection. So that's good, but again, we're sort of playing catch up. On AI, we can suddenly use AI and sort of virtual agents to tell us where do we have gaps in our security estate, to help us prioritize, remediation, to, automate things like patching, to essentially be like eyes on the ball in a way that humans sort of missed some of these alerts. Now we can use AI to sort of triage these alerts. And some of the big attacks that I covered at the Times were things like Target. Target was their point of sale system, the way that you check out at the register was compromised. And a cybersecurity tool caught that, and it fired off an alert. But unfortunately, the alert got missed between time zones and never picked up, and then it led to this massive attack at Target. Now, it doesn't matter what time zone you're on. The AI is always watching. So in some ways, AI is up-leveling us. We're also seeing tools used to fill these like vacant jobs in cybersecurity. So there's a lot of work that needs to go into things that are not that exciting, at least don't sound that exciting, which is third-party risk assessment. Assessing, do all my vendors have, are they applying NIST standards? Are they using multi-factor authentication? Are they using strong security protocols? Now there are tools coming to market that have agents that do all of that for you. And not just one time a year through some kind of like paperwork compliance checklist, but 24/7, they're continuously scanning your third-party systems and third-party software to tell you if anything's off track. So in that sense, AI is a godsend in some ways. Unfortunately, again, I think the bad guys have sort of first mover advantage and will continue to have first mover advantage for a while.
Pulling the thread a little bit on the things that aren't exciting, we have a lot of founders and soon-to-be founders here in this room, and one of the things that you've brought up in your book and in your podcast is this friction between moving fast and breaking things and then also putting in the right security measures, which tend to be a little non-exciting and maybe not the priority of a lot of founders. What are things that founders, future founders can do to protect their companies and also the customers they serve?
So one thing I worry about a lot is AI for coding. There's this saying, there was a lecture given, I think it was 70 years ago, by a guy named Ken Thompson, and he was awarded this very prestigious award in cybersecurity called the Turing Award, named after Alan Turing. And when he won the award, he used his turn at the lectern to give this speech called Reflections on Trusting Trust. And the point of the lecture was to say, you'll never be able to trust source code you didn't write yourself. And I think about it all the time now, because now we're using AI for coding. And there's a big question of how secure is this code? And you'd think that using AI, they'd be able to sort of factor in all the mistakes that we've made for years, for decades even. And unfortunately, there was a Veracode study that came out late last year, not even that late, maybe August, and they looked at LLM-generated code, and at best, it received an F, 55 out of 100 at secure coding. And so that's a huge red flag, because when you think of how much more code we're generating using AI, and then you think about where that code is going, and you think about just how vulnerable it still is, that's not a great place to be. And I don't think we're talking about that at all. Now, Claude, Anthropic is partnering with some technologies like SemGrep that do a better job of sort of taking the context in and trying to address very urgent security vulnerabilities. And I think that'll be a great, that is one thread of hope that I have. But I think founders right now, you can create a company in a day. You can use Lovable to do so much. It's so exciting. But I think we have to make sure that people understand that every time you introduce new code, you're widening an attack surface. And it's not a theoretical that it will come back to bite you. It's like I said, it's like there will be bad guys scanning for your vulnerabilities continuously. And when they find them, they can now exploit them in sub-seconds in some cases. And so it's really important that you understand that you are part of a broader ecosystem, and the decisions you make around things like secure coding, or whether or not to use strong MFA, or changing the default passwords, or monitoring for basic behavior so you can flag any anomalous or abnormal behavior. All of that is really, really critical no matter what area you're building in.
I'm so glad you brought up some specific things people can do: multi-factor authentication, monitoring systems. I think maybe just a show of hands, who's ever used vibe coding in this room? Okay, so a lot of probably particularly new founders. I think probably their concern is, well, if I'm not using this, then I'm going to fall behind because everyone's using this. So I guess are there any additional small things that founders can take if they don't have the money to pay a software engineer to actually look over the code, or they have to rely on vibe coding?
Yeah, and I think that's where the tooling is just getting better and better, like things like SemGrep, or, definitely take a look at SemGrep. Because it's able to it's almost like a spell check for code. And so it's showing you as you're vibe coding, like where these vulnerabilities are popping up. And then the other nice thing about it is it's taking in the full context of what you're building. So it's not just alert after alert after alert and you're drowning in alerts. It's actually using that context to give you actionable steps that don't drown you out and make you just throw up your hands. And I think those are really exciting. And I think, the fact that Claude is integrating that is a really good sign. And I'm really glad, I don't think Anthropic's perfect, but I am really relieved and grateful that they are using their position to create these market pressures around things like security and surveillance.
Yeah, that's awesome. I hope all the builders out there are taking some notes. I'd love to kind of broaden the scope a little bit and talk about how AI is changing our access to information and the validity of information that we have access to. And one of the things you brought up during our pre-call was an anecdote about Saudi Arabia altering the amount and the amount that they're charging AI companies for energy based on the AI companies' guarantees to portray Saudi Arabia in a certain way in their LLM outputs. And that's pretty remarkable to me. Are there other instances of nation states or other actors affecting how we're receiving information via AI?
So I think the instance you're referring to was, lawyers at OpenAI confided in me, and I'm happy to, basically cite them in an anonymous context here, that governments like Saudi Arabia are using the foothold that they now have in terms of data centers and AI backend infrastructure to try to pressure some of the big LLM makers to start censoring their outputs to outputs that are more favorable to the regime, essentially using their footholds as leverage for censorship. And companies like OpenAI, fortunately, have boatloads of lawyers that they can tap into to push back on it. But I think there's a big question, which is what happens when every SaaS company has its own LLM? Who will be able to fight back against some of this, pretty, strong external pressure? And so on that, one thing I've been advocating for is we need third-party independent tooling that can mind read these LLMs in as close to real time as possible. And that's another exciting technology that's coming to market. There's a company I invested in through my mission fund called Realm Labs that is doing this. And they're able to show you, where is there potential censorship that's happening in real time. And I think that's another thing we're not talking about enough is like, who is behind these LLMs? Who makes these decisions? Sometimes it's newsworthy when things like Grok, start spitting out something racist, and then you're like, what happened here on the back end, right? But you only hear about these things when they become truly newsworthy. And the news business, in case you haven't been paying attention, is having a lot of trouble and market pressures recently. So I think we definitely need to start pushing for some sort of independent tooling that can show us who might be tipping the scales and where.
I'm glad you bring that up because it seems like there's a lot of really dark, scary things going on in the world of AI and disinformation. And I'm wondering if there is room for optimism. And it sounds like there are some technologies that are countering potentially the disinformation threat. Can you talk a little bit more about the type of technology you've seen and what you're investing in now?
Yeah, and then I'll caveat it with something a little bit depressing, but unfortunately, a lot of this is not that uplifting. But I always say like cybersecurity is the number 3 threat that I track. The number 2 threat, I think, is climate change because resource wars, and I think will become a huge national security issue. And we could talk about, throw income inequality in there too when you combine all 3. But number 1, I think, is disinformation. And part of it is what's happening to the press, certainly. But I think a lot of it is just, again, the barrier to entry for mass disinformation campaigns has effectively collapsed with AI. And so there are companies out there now, like Alethea Group is one of them, Blackbird is another, that, you want to go back to Sally? Okay. That can help you track narrative attacks against your brand. And they're doing a great job. And sometimes they're doing some pro bono work for different foundations. And they're helping you track these narrative attacks, and then they're helping you with remediation strategies in real time, takedown requests. They can identify, is this a coordinated bot campaign, or is this a couple individuals? Where are they from? What kind of tooling are they using, et cetera, et cetera. So that's great, and we need that. The problem I worry about is that these tools are really becoming the provenance of the 0.001%. So those companies I just mentioned, to get off the ground and go to market, they have to pitch to the Fortune 100. But then you kind of think about, well, who does that leave? And yeah, some of them are doing great work to make their services available to people who are running for office and various foundations. But I worry about the rest of us. Like, what are we going to use when someone decides they don't like us for whatever reason, or we write a book that someone doesn't like? And I think when you start sort of extrapolating on that, you see how these tools could become real censorship. Have very powerful silencing capabilities. And, occasionally I'll get pitched by companies that, essentially one of them was a company that produces legal agents that can essentially send legal takedown requests to anyone who's posting anything negative about you. Well, their biggest backers were Elon Musk, Sam Altman, and Bill Ackman. So they are on Twitter saying, hey, we should dismantle anyone who's trying to track these coordinated campaigns on Twitter, right? That's censorship. But in the background, they're investing heavily and using agents that are sending legal takedown requests all day long on their behalf.
Oh my gosh.
So what about the rest of us? And then you start thinking about that future, and that gets very dystopian. So I think those tools, we need to figure out how either to set real limits or have real, not censorship, but real ways to track these coordinated campaigns, to out them and take them down. Or we need to figure out how to democratize the tooling that outs them at scale. And that's very, very difficult. And I think, much more difficult even than some of the cybersecurity challenges I'm focused on.
Yeah, absolutely. Is there anything that the individual can do, or like the little guys can do at this point to protect themselves from disinformation?
No, really, no. You can always go on these platforms and call a spade and say, hey, I'm under attack. And I've seen some people do that really well. I've also seen that only incentivize more trolling and more disinformation. And so it's very, very difficult. And it's not my focus, but I've decided, I really need to start calling this out. I'll tell you a very interesting story. So I spoke at this thing called the Business Roundtable. And this is a very elite group of Fortune 100 CEOs. You want to stay with me? Okay. And so they get together, and I went and I spoke on stage, and it was me and George Kurtz, the CEO of CrowdStrike. And I talked about ransomware that day. And then afterwards, you go to a dinner. And so I was in the shuttle, and I was sitting next to, hold on, honey. I was sitting next to the CEO of Rio Tinto, like the big mining company. And he said, yeah, Nicole, I listened to your speech. It was great, yada, yada. Ransomware, we get it. We have a blank check for ransomware and cybersecurity. I want to talk to you about disinformation. And he said, I want to tell you what happened to me. He said, we had I think it was a lithium mine. It was a cobalt or lithium. And it was in Serbia. And we had we'd committed $2 billion of investment, jobs, whatever it was it cobalt or whatever we use in electric vehicle batteries? Yeah, so anyway, everyone was unusually on board with this mining project. And he said, all we had to do was do the televised ribbon cutting ceremony. So he flies to Serbia, they do the televised ribbon cutting ceremony. Immediately, they get hit with Russian bots and trolls. And they're hitting them with all sorts of conspiracy theories about the CEO personally, about the mine project, that it was going to create acid rain, that it was going to be this huge environmental disaster. I haven't done my own independent assessment. My understanding was they had done all the environmental impact assessments. None of this was true. And it was so effective that you started going to Serbian soccer matches, and you started seeing people in the stands holding up signs, protesting the mine. You started seeing like horrible personal conspiracy theories about the CEO and the then Prime Minister of Serbia, who I think may have even been the first female Prime Minister of Serbia. And finally, she called him and said, I'm really sorry, but I'm up for re-election in the fall, and we have to shut this mine down. He said, Nicole, I was prepared for a $50 million, $100 million ransomware attack. I was not prepared for a $2 billion disinformation attack. And there was nothing. There was no playbook. Everyone on my comms team said, just don't give it oxygen. Don't respond. Put your head down. It'll go away. It's so insane. It'll go away. It'll go away. And it didn't go away. And it cost them $2 billion. And then he said, if I couldn't do it at Rio Tinto, like, what chance does everyone else have to fight back against some of these narrative attacks? Yeah. And I didn't have a good answer. And that's actually when I went out and tried to find one. And I landed on Lisa Kaplan at Alethea, who's amazing. You should actually have her to one of these. She's an incredible entrepreneur.
Wow, well, that's a very humbling story. Thanks for sharing it. Also, it sounds like there's maybe scant room for optimism, but we can still be hopeful that something comes out in the future that can help curb disinformation. One more question for me, and then I'll open it up to the audience. So we've heard a lot about Anthropic over the last few days and their friction with the Department of War. It really brings to light a question about who gets to decide what the safety guardrails are on AI, and also brings to light a new dynamic on corporate responsibility. What's your perspective on this in light of what's going on with Anthropic?
Well, I'm already blanking on what was the second stipulation. It was mass surveillance, and what was the second one?
Oh, I am all about
Oh, right.
Yes,
Autonomous weapons. You know, at least they called it out, right? I mean, otherwise we might not know about it. And of course, another company, whether it's OpenAI or someone else, will step into that void and take that $200 million government contract, right? But wow, I mean, it's really amazing to me just how far we've fallen just in this discussion since Snowden. I was highly involved with some of the Snowden coverage. In my book, I talk about how I had to work from this makeshift skiff for months away from my family on some of what the NSA was doing at the time. And we've circled back to a point where the trust we had to build back up between the public and private sector after Snowden was really hard. Because if you remember during the Snowden mess, we were seeing like little Post-its that, claimed to show that the NSA had somehow hacked into Google's back-end infrastructure and was collecting data unencrypted. And so, in cybersecurity, we're not, and I'm sorry, this is a little bit of a tangential answer, but we're never going to get out of this without the public and the private sector working together hand in hand. And that's where I'm most afraid is, first of all, like, good for Anthropic for taking a stand on mass surveillance. And I liked that they were very specific in saying, we're not actually ready to start using autonomous weapons yet and baking AI into autonomous weapons. Mm-hmm. I thought that was a very specific call out because it's a very visceral call out too, right? Like, what could go wrong? And good for them for creating this market pressure around security, thank God. But man, it's like the money is winning the day right now with AI. We are building these things at breakneck speed, and I don't see anyone in this administration talking thoughtfully about regulation. Sometimes I listen to the All In podcast and I'm like, turn it off. Turn it off, because when they do bring up some of these nightmare scenarios that I've come really close to seeing firsthand, play out firsthand, they always downplay it. And I just hope there are some adults in the room who are bringing up, how these things could really go off the rails. So that's that. I don't have anything more thoughtful to say on it than that, but we'll see. I will say, right now, there was a FBI, CISA, I think NSA, joint advisory that went out last night about what we should be worried about with regard to Iran. And it's very real. I covered a number of instances where we saw Iran trying to attack critical infrastructure. I covered an attack where they attacked Saudi Aramco. They got into their business IT systems. They tried to get into their back-end pipeline OT systems, we call them, and they weren't successful. but they basically detonated malware that bricked 30,000 Aramco computers and took all their data and replaced them with an image of a burning American flag. And it was the most expensive attack on record. It paralyzed operations at Saudi Aramco. It sent oil prices up to get the number of desktop computers that they needed to replace those systems. Like if you had tried to buy a computer during that period, it would have been much more expensive than your usual desktop computer. Anyway, point is, these Iranian hackers tried and weren't successful. They're much better now, and we actually have seen them poking around critical infrastructure. We have seen them get into these OT systems. We saw a lot of this in sort of the peak of the Israeli-Hamas situation. We saw them poking around water treatment facilities, wastewater systems, oil and gas here, and also in Israel. And they're pre-positioning. That was pre-positioning for a future attack. And now, what this joint advisory report was saying was like, you have to look for evidence that they're inside your systems, because based on what we've seen before, in many cases, they're already there. And right now, with what's been happening, they have little left to lose. They're gonna try everything. So I think actually right now, I'm talking about disinformation. I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about that a little bit, because I think that's the far more immediate risk that we have today. Okay.
Okay, on that, we are going to open up to questions from the audience. So we'll go ahead and start here.
Do I need a mic or?
No, I think it's all right.
Okay. Thank you very much. I'm a short-term visiting scholar here at Stanford from Estonia, cybersecurity expert from Estonia. It's great to see that your book has also been translated into Estonian, so great to have you here. Based on your work with Ukraine, I wanted to, and referring to the topic, I wanted to ask if you have if you're looking more closely or have some insights into some useful practices from the Baltics or from the war in Ukraine of combining these threats of yours, number 3 and number 1, the disinformation, cybersecurity, countering Russia in that sense mostly. Could you share some thoughts on that? Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much. And I was in Estonia last year speaking about this specific question on what are the learnings to come out of Ukraine. So it's the ultimate case study. And there's a lot of hope in it. And I should have remembered it when you asked about hope and room for optimism. No one remembers any real cyber attack that Russia pulled off in Ukraine since they invaded. And so I think there's this dangerous misdiagnosis that nothing happened, when in fact we saw unprecedented cyber attacks against Ukraine. Now, part of it is once the bombs start dropping, they become less useful and people don't really care as much about cyber attacks. If the bomb takes out the power infrastructure, okay. It's not so interesting that they were trying to take it out with cyber, right? But here's what's interesting. So there were these unprecedented attacks. So the first thing that happened was they sent these denial of service attacks after Ukrainian government agencies and banks. And we mitigated them. We actually brought in Cloudflare, and we brought in Google, and we brought in AWS, and we were able to mitigate them within 24 hours. And a lot of this I had a front row seat to through my affiliation with CISA. The second thing that happened was they took out Viasat, which was this internet satellite broadband provider. And that would have cut Ukraine's internet access, essentially. And there's a great story I could share later. But in came Starlink, and there was this fabulous story waiting to be told about how they got all that Starlink infrastructure into Ukraine from Poland on short order. And Starlink, for whatever I think about Elon Musk, actually gave Ukraine a big fighting chance. It kept their military comms online, and it really kept them online and made it possible for them to air all this footage of what Russia was doing and fight a lot of the disinformation. And then they did come after the power infrastructure with cyber attacks, but actually ESET and Ukraine's Cyber Defense Agency and CISA and other entities in the private sector all came together, and they were able to discover it and root it out before it was time to detonate a few months later. And then there's something, then there was this miraculous declassification of something called pipe dream, which was by the way, everyone, thank you for being here with my 2-year-old Remy today. There was this tool that they discovered called pipe dream. And pipe dream was essentially a digital Swiss Army knife that you could use to hack any kind of critical infrastructure, and very powerful. And somehow we found it when it was in development and declassified it before it was ready for use, and warned everyone essentially how to mitigate against this pipe dream tool. So all of those things are like tiny miracles, in my opinion. And they were all lessons in what happens when you have true real-time threat intelligence sharing between the public and private sector. And all of it comes down to trust between the public and private sector. And I think that is the case study we need to probably be teaching at the GSB and elsewhere, because that's what it takes, especially here in the US. Israel has made more compromises on privacy in the name of security. But last time I checked, we still don't want the NSA or Cyber Command inside our private enterprises, monitoring traffic in real time, sniffing for these attacks. But 80% of our critical infrastructure is owned, operated, maintained, and hopefully secured by the private sector. So if we want to keep it that way, and we want to keep these privacy rules up, then we need to make sure that the private sector is looking for what they need to be looking for, logging, tracking, defending, that the government is declassifying these threats, sharing what they know from their foreign field operations with the private sector, that the private sector's triaging those attacks and prioritizing them. And all of that requires this kind of constant communication between the two. So, whether it's what's happening with Anthropic and the memo and the federal government, or just sort of this breakdown in trust that we're seeing because of ICE or whatever it is, those are huge cybersecurity red flags. And I think that actually is not a technical issue at all. It's really like one of public-private partnership that we need to start talking about in much bigger formats. But yeah, I think like that's the hopeful next book to be written, is like what happened to come together to basically keep Ukraine online through all of that. And there's a lot of hope and a lot of lessons to be shared there.
Hi, thank you, Nicole. I actually started my career in the Cyber Defense Operations Center of Microsoft. So I was in war rooms when SolarWinds was happening and various other zero-day attacks. So I just want to commend you for making this subject so accessible to everyone in the room who didn't spend a lot of time in those rooms. And I also later led product for a cybersecurity startup that was looking at software supply chain risk. So this is just, an incredible talk, very relevant to, I think, everyone in the room. But I'm actually curious about your opinion about the Paramount, Skydance, and Warner Brothers merger, if we're talking about disinformation and media merging, and maybe your thoughts on that and how this affects.
I have so much to worry about with cybersecurity, and then I've added disinformation since that story I shared about Rio Tinto. But I don't spend a lot of time thinking about journalism, but I obviously worry about it, and what's happened at the Washington Post, I think, is a harbinger of what could come in a different format with the merger. I mean, having all of those entities, having CNN, under Larry Ellison's control, or David Ellison, is not great. I don't know what to do, guys. I hope you guys can all go out there and solve this one. The line I always use is like, the truth is paywalled and the lies are free. And that is a very elitist opinion, right? I fully, will tell you that. But I also tell you that at the New York Times, the New York Times should get and has earned a lot of the criticism that it gets. And when you're inside the walls, there's no bigger critics, I assure you, than people who work inside the New York Times about the New York Times. But what I saw with my own two eyes every day there was just people doing the best they possibly could to share the unbiased truth under very difficult circumstances and very difficult timelines. And with a lot of bureaucracy. I always say the real reason I left the New York Times was the effing bureaucracy of the New York Times. But people are really doing their best. And you should and can criticize them all day long when they get things wrong. And hopefully they own up to it with corrections. But there was never anyone who told me, don't write that because you could potentially offend our corporate overlord or advertiser. Ever, 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 ever. There's a great story when I joined about that they share at orientation about one of our reporters at the magazine went out and wrote a story, I'm sure you could find it, about all the places adults were getting high at Disneyland. And they published the story, and the reporter told the story about how Jill Abramson, who was the executive editor at the time, was like, get in my office. And she's like, you have to sit here, Disney's calling. And they called and they made them sit through this call where they were like, are you kidding me? We are your biggest advertiser. Like, why would you write this story? And they just all kind of like nodded along, hung up the phone, and then Jill turned to the reporter and said, it was a great story, And they never did anything differently, and that was our biggest advertiser that year. So we're in a different place now, and by the way, I remember when I was working on the Snowden documents, I tell the story in my book, I had to work out of Arthur Sulzberger's storage closet. So it was right outside his office. It was the only room in the New York Times that didn't have windows. And one of Snowden's stipulations was we couldn't work out of a room with windows because foreign governments could shoot lasers at the windows and hear everything we were doing. And the New York Times, funny story, was built by Renzo Piano as a model for full transparency. So there's no room in the building that doesn't have windows except for bathrooms and this one storage closet. So I was in Arthur's storage closet when the news broke that Jeff Bezos had acquired the Washington Post. And I remember, so he popped in and told us the news. And I said, oh my God, are you scared? Is this terrible for us? And he said, no, this is great. Like, we need great competition out there. Everyone does their best work when they have an equal competitor. This is like a great thing for journalism. And I think it was for a time. But then we saw what happened with, the presidential endorsement ahead of the last election. And now we're seeing, what's happening with cuts and some influence over coverage. And, Larry Ellison is not known for being the most neutral party on things like this. So more is coming, and that's terrifying. And I think for a long time, you would hear people like Bernie Sanders talk about the millionaires and the billionaires, Sally says it better than I do, who own, the big media companies. And I sort of would roll my eyes because my experience was, well, we've never seen our coverage really touched based on profit motivations or based on our owners. And that's not true anymore. So I'm just, I'm depressed about it, but I'm going to leave it all to you all to figure that piece out.
Well, Nicole, we know you have a flight to run to, so we're going to go ahead and wrap things up. But I would just like to say that I'm very glad that you're doing the work you're doing and making this information available to the lay people who don't otherwise understand cybersecurity, and that you're now investing in things that could potentially change the landscape moving forward. So thank you so much for what you do and for being here today, and also bringing Remy with you. This has been such a delight.